Welcome to my How Healthy Are You weekly educational podcast. My name is Dr. Thomas Brewer. I'm a PhD chemist and nutritional blood microscopist. Today is November 8th, 2021, and this is podcast number 108. Today's podcast is going to be on sodium and potassium. So one of the first things I want to mention is if any of you are getting salt cravings, especially after eating something sweet, I wanted to explain why that occurs. So chemically what happens is sodium leaks out of our cells due to something called osmotic pressure. So sodium goes from high levels to lower levels across a cell membrane. This is similar to how we clean water. If you have a reverse osmosis system, again, something is crossing a membrane, and in that case, the clean water is in one side, and everything else moves to the other side. Something similar happens in our cells due to changes in what's called osmotic pressure. So when we have high glucose levels, we end up transferring sodium out the other side of the membrane. So also when this happens, we're also low in potassium. So we lose sodium and we also lose potassium. So when you eat something sweet and you crave salt, well, that's because you're really sodium deficient. So sodium deficiency means you end up craving salt. It's very common. Anytime you crave something, it's because there is a deficiency. So sometimes women will crave ice cream when they're pregnant because they're calcium deficient. Sometimes animals will eat dirt because they're deficient in some mineral in the dirt. Usually it's iron. So this is known for mammals. And for sodium deficiency, like I said, you crave salt. Now, when you're sodium deficient, some possible outcomes is you end up with a headache. You also end up with adrenal stress. And therefore, if you were to consume sodium when you had a headache or some adrenal stress, consuming sodium will calm you for a short time, but really you want to get to the heart of the problem. Now, potassium deficiency comes with no actual craving. So with sodium deficiency, yep, you'll crave something sweet, and you'll also crave salt. But for potassium, there won't be any actual craving. Now, the best thing to do if you're potassium deficient, and typically if you're sodium deficient, that's what it really means. You're also potassium deficient. You just need to eat more salads, more vegetables. Things like avocado, too, are also great for potassium. Now, it's hard to sleep if you have potassium deficiency, yet you'll be tired. So you'll have more fatigue, but you'll have trouble falling asleep. You could also have leg cramps, but it's not like you will crave something. So, all right, now, just to remember, the sodium to potassium ratio in our diet should be somewhere between 1 to 2, all the way up to 1 to 4. The bottom line is the amount of potassium is always higher than the amount of sodium that we need. And if you remember that and do that, you won't have trouble. So you want your potassium intake to be at least twice your sodium intake, and everything will actually balance out. Now, if sodium is low or potassium, what ends up happening is insulin resistance. So that's where insulin is building up in the blood. It doesn't cross the cell membrane with sugar, so therefore sugar builds up. Now, insulin resistance is a bad thing. Eventually, it leads to diabetes because there's too much glucose or sugar buildup in the blood, but it's the insulin that builds up. first and can't drag the glucose across the cell membrane. Now, this is what's somewhat ironic, is if sodium is low in the body or potassium is low and you have this insulin resistance, you also end up with high blood pressure. What, you may ask? Your sodium is low, yet you end up with high blood pressure. So this is a bit of a fallacy that we're often told by our medical doctors. The assumption's always made if your blood pressure is high, it's because you're consuming too much sodium. That isn't actually quite true. If the blood pressure is high, really what you want to do is increase potassium, and even if you're salt sensitive, you want to increase potassium, again, through vegetables like salads. Now, when you consume more potassium, your ratio of sodium to potassium will get correct, and that's the same effect as reducing sodium. So you can lower your sodium intake, but most of the time that is not the problem with high blood pressure. The problem is not enough potassium, which means that ratio is off. So if you increase the potassium, you'll end up with the right sodium to potassium ratio. So high blood pressure, you can have a low sodium diet. It always confuses people. So again, eat more potassium-rich foods. So in general, we all need about a teaspoon of salt per day. That ends up the right amount of sodium. So table salt is actually sodium chloride, so it is not 100% per unit of sodium, so it's mixed with chloride. But roughly a teaspoon of salt a day is ideal. Some people get way more than that, and that's because they're eating foods that come with excess sodium. But many people don't. They don't get enough sodium because they're afraid of it, and in actuality, they're low in sodium. Now, when you're low in sodium, you need that sodium for nerve impulses, so that's how conduction is occurring through our nerves. Muscles must contract, and therefore sodium is necessary. Sodium also allows calcium to transport across cell membranes. Don't be afraid of eating a small amount of sodium. And especially this is true if you're craving salt at night, you're sodium deficient. Whether you consumed something sweet or not, if you're craving salt at night, you're sodium deficient. In general, it's potassium that really protects our heart, and potassium is extremely important, and that's why we want to keep increasing our potassium intake along with sodium. If you're low in sodium, you end up with more risk factors for heart attack and stroke and insulin resistance and adrenal fatigue and hypothyroid. So you see there are a lot of problems that come when we're low in sodium. And a lot of them we've been taught just the opposite. So if I were to say, well, low sodium increases your risk factor for heart attack, you'd think, no, high sodium increases your risk factor for heart attack. But that isn't the case. You want to have the right amount of sodium and potassium, just like you want to have the right blood pressure or the right pulse or the right amount of cholesterol in the body. So 0 for these numbers is a problem. We don't want your blood pressure to be 0. That means you're dead. There is this fine range, just like your sodium and potassium levels. They must be in a range. So that's what I have for this podcast. Please subscribe and leave a comment. And as always, thanks for listening.